Welcome to NASW Mass Chapter's 7th Annual MLK Junior Forum on Racial Justice. My name is Rebecca Gewertz, and I'm the Executive Director of NASW Mass Chapter. Before we get started, I want to thank our organizers for making tonight's event possible. Jamie Cluffs, Cassidy Trabilsi, our intern. Jamie Cluffs is our Director of Communications and Strategic Initiatives, and our staff, in particular, Michael LaBerge, helping us on the technological side of things. Dr. Ibram Kendi, author of How to Be Anti-Racist, states that the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it and then dismantle it. As social work professionals operate in an omnipresent white supremacist culture, at NASW Mass Chapter, we view this statement as a call to action. Tonight's continuing education event will address racism within the social work profession and define practices that social workers can use to dismantle white supremacy culture and racist systems within their respective workplaces and in our state and nation. The very esteemed panel we have convened will elevate the voices and perspectives of social workers with varied racial and ethnic identities, while empowering all social workers to work together to dismantle racism. Tonight, we also gather on a historic night for our country. Today, we watched as the 46th President of the United States, Joe Biden, was sworn in, and the first Black Asian American woman, Kamala Harris, was sworn in as our Vice President. Of course, this was an exciting event for so many. At the same time, they were inaugurated against the backdrop of a large military presence because of the riot incited by the previous president and carried out by white supremacists, largely on January 6th. Barack Obama recently said, if anyone had a right to question whether our democracy was worth redeeming, it was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because in the face of billy clubs and lynchings, poll taxes and literacy tests, he never gave in to violence, never waved a traitorous flag, or gave up on our country. Like Dr. King, each day, social workers go to work to make our state, nation, and world better by helping others and through organized action for change. Tonight, we will learn how to be more intentional and more empowered to dismantle the systems of oppression. Together, we can help see through President Biden's vision when he said today that the dream of justice will be deferred no longer. Because indeed, as inaugural poet Amanda Gorman concluded, there is always light if we're only brave enough to see it, brave enough to be it. I want to thank our moderator, Dr. Rob Eschman of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research, who will guide us through the rest of the evening. If you have questions or comments, you can please feel free to use the chat feature. That's what it's there for. Jamie Cluffs will be sending comments to Rob to be incorporated into the discussion. Please remember, you must stay for the entire program to receive your CE credits. The CE code will be read aloud at the end of the event. You might be wondering about the evaluation. It was linked in the email you received yesterday, and it will be shared again at the end of the event in the chat. If you aren't a member of NASW, now is my moment to ask you to please join. And to say that if you are a member, thank you. Our work is powered by your membership. And now a little bit about our moderator. So Dr. Robert Eschman is an assistant professor at the BU School of Social Work, a school of social work we know well and work with frequently. He's the faculty affiliate in the Department of Sociology, faculty affiliate in African American Studies program, and Assistant Director of Research at the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. Dr. Eschman writes on educational inequality, community violence, racism, social media, and youth well-being. His research seeks to uncover individual, group, and institutional level barriers to racial and economic equity, and he pays special attention to the heroic efforts every day people make to combat those barriers. Dr. Eschman's research investigates the effects of online experiences of real-world outcomes. From his work on the relationship between online communication and community violence to his current work on race and racism in the digital era, his research bridges the gap between virtual and face-to-face experiences. His forthcoming book with the University of California Press, When the Hood Comes Off, racism, and resistance in the digital era was to systemically explore the ways online communication has changed the expressions of racism, its effects on communities of color in society, and resistance to racism at individual and structural levels. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Dr. Eschman, for being our moderator. I know this event will be inspiring and important for social work practice now and into the years ahead. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to you, Dr. Eschman.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you also, Jamie, and the organizers of this event for inviting me to be here with you today. And of course, thank you everybody for showing up to learn with us. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to, explore some of Dr. King's legacy with you today. Each year, when we celebrate Dr. King, we sometimes, unfortunately, see people take his quotes out of context in order to support their own agendas, or to take his quotes out of context and to misuse his ideas when they may not be engaging in anti-racist practice. And so these misuses of King's words can sometimes sting. And when this happens, it's important to see and give reminders of who Dr. King really was, a leader who knew the problem of racism to be more than skin deep, who understood the relationship between capitalism, imperialism, and racial oppression, and who was killed because of the radical changes that he was calling for, that he had made, and that he was continuing to fight for. I'm really glad that this event is happening today on the day of the inauguration. Today was an important day for America, but just because Trump is gone does not mean that our work is finished. Dr. King didn't shy away from challenging those in power, and neither should we. When speaking out against the Vietnam War, Dr. King said, "I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without first having spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." Some might call this a radical statement. Some might not be comfortable with this type of criticism of our country. There are some patriots who believe that it is un-American to criticize America. For example, in Arizona, high school classes that taught that founding fathers were racist were banned because they were seen as being un-American. That some of the founding fathers were racist is a historical fact. Many were slave owners, overseeing the torture of other human beings, and several wrote extensively on their racist views about the inferiority of blacks. Surely this meets the criteria of racist. Despite this truth, there are those who wish to deny the realities of racism, especially when it implicates themselves or the institutions that they hold dear. I believe that it honors Dr. King's legacy to have this conversation about racism and anti-racism with people who are okay with honest self-critique of our country, our profession, and ourselves, even when it makes us uncomfortable. To discuss anti-racism with people who are looking to be anti-racist, not just with words, but with practice. As social workers, we are part of a profession that at its core is concerned with the marginalized, the most vulnerable members of our society. Anti-racism is and should be central to who we are. Of course, we as a profession have a long way to go, and part of the goal of this event is to understand how social work and social workers sometimes operate within white supremacy culture. Our panel speakers tonight are going to push us to interrogate ourselves and our profession as we seek to become more effective anti-racists and social workers. So, although many of you may never want to hear about Donald again, now that he's officially gone, I want to spend a moment thinking about what Trump meant for how we understand racism and anti-racism in the 21st century. I hope that we can call this the beginning of the post-Trump era, although time will tell the extent to which the movement Trump started continues in the next few years. So first, let's start with some definitions. What does it mean to be anti-racist? Ibram Kendi defines an anti-racist as one who is supporting anti-racist policies through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. By this broad definition, anti-racism can take many forms. Our methods and styles of anti-racist practice will need to shift depending on the styles and expressions of racism that we are up against. And as I'm going to talk about, these styles have certainly been changing over the past few years. There are many definitions of racism, and often differences in definition lead to misunderstandings. Rarely does everyone agree on what racism looks like. For example, most people define racism as the open, ugly style of racism that was common in the years before the civil rights movement. For these people, racists are those who wear white hoods and ride with the Ku Klux Klan, or these days, the Proud Boys or the alt-right. This is why so many people get defensive when we talk about something being racist. But that is a very limited definition of racism. Not all racists wear hoods. My favorite definition of racism comes from Bill Wilson, professor emeritus at Harvard, who in his 1973 book, Power, Racism, and Privilege, says that racism is an ideology of racial domination or exploitation that, one, incorporates beliefs in a particular race's cultural and or inherent biological inferiority, and two, uses such beliefs to justify and prescribe inferior treatment for that group. So this is a two-part definition. The first part says that racism is an ideology, an idea about one racial group being inferior. The second part is just as important. Racism is when beliefs about inferiority are used to justify treating a certain racial group badly. Racism is not just an attitude. Racism is an attitude with a purpose. The purpose of racism is to reinforce and justify racial oppression. Before the civil rights movement, racism was open and in your face. What kind of racist attitudes do you need to justify openly discriminatory laws, policies, and signs outside of restaurants that say no blacks allowed? You need open and explicit racist attitudes. Blacks are inferior and should be kept away from us. Racism was more explicit when racism was legal. But today, open discrimination has been outlawed. Racism is more subtle. Racial oppression and inequality persists, even though there are no signs that say no blacks allowed. But we know racism is still here in mass incarceration, as Black and Latinx people are more likely to be arrested and are given longer sentences for the same crimes. Racism persists in our unequal education system, which makes Black and Latinx children more likely to be in poor schools. Racism continues through health disparities as people of color have increased incidences of a host of health problems and decreased life expectancy. Remember, the purpose of racism is to justify racial inequality. Racists don't need open, ugly racism to justify mass incarceration, educational inequality, or health disparities. You just need to believe that people of color are to blame for their own problems. You just need to ignore structural, institutional, systemic inequality that privileges whites and limits the opportunities that communities of color have to succeed. One of my favorite books is Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists, which argues that the most common form of racism is colorblind racism. People who say they don't see race represent the most common form of racists. Most racists today don't hate Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, or other communities of color. Most racists today just blame these groups for their own problems and support policies that protect their own privileges and self-interests and continue this racial inequality. Because we have gotten so used to this subtle, quiet form of racism, we were surprised to see Donald Trump. Open racism is seen as being taboo, and typically politicians are particularly skilled at avoiding racist language, even when they're evoking racist fears. Social workers are all too familiar with this style of coded racism, from references to welfare queens or super predators driving policymaking to other veiled language that hints at the racial anxieties of white America without being explicitly racist. But Trump represents a group of people who are fed up with the careful, politically correct language that is typical in political debates in most mainstream spaces. His refusal to conform to traditional standards of talking about race made him popular with white supremacists and made him the poster boy for racism over the past 4 years. When he was running for president in 2016, many on the left believed he had no chance because they thought Americans would never vote for someone who was so openly racist, sexist, homophobic, and openly made fun of differently abled persons. I remember when Trump was elected in 2016. I was in my final year as a PhD student at the University of Chicago in the School of Social Work, and I was on the job market interviewing for positions as a professor. No one could believe when Trump won. My colleagues and professors walked around as if they were lost in a fog. It felt as if the entire social work profession was in mourning. Many people in social work and on the left in general saw Donald Trump as an open racist, someone who used more coarse language to describe race than is typical for politicians in the US. How could the country elect an openly racist president in 2016? We couldn't believe that Trump had been elected, but we should have believed it, given what we know about how insidious racism is, how persistent, despite decades of legal victories purging our laws of open discrimination. During the Trump years, anti-racism seemed to be a much easier task. People who were unable to recognize subtle and structural racism in our racial capitalist system recognized it in Trump. For many people, it took Trump's more open, ugly language to make them realize there was racism behind these types of policies. For example, actor Jennifer Lawrence said, "My first time voting, I voted for John McCain. I was a little Republican. For me, when Donald Trump got elected, that just changed everything. Because this is an impeached president who's broken many laws and has refused to condemn white supremacy. I don't want to support a president who supports white supremacists." In my research on how technology shapes the way people experience and understand racism, I argue that technology can unmask racism. It can reveal the ways that racism operates behind the scenes. For some people I interviewed, being exposed to overt racism challenged their worldview and made them realize that racism was still alive, when before they believed that it was a relic of the past. For other people, however, exposure to overt racism provided them with evidence of the continuing significance of racism. They had known racism was real all along and used examples of unmasked racism online to convince others of this fact. The exposure of racism in this way strengthened their anti-racist toolkits. I think Trump has had a similar effect to technology in this way. Trump has unmasked racism. He has reminded people that racism is not dead. He has given open white supremacists confidence, and many believe that he wants them to stand back and stand by. But also, people who were unable to recognize subtle racism and hopped onto the anti-racist wagon to resist Trump might now assume that the battle against racism has been won. With Trump out of the office, colorblind racists can go back to believing that we are in a post-racial world and that people of color are responsible for their own failure to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Trump, like racism, is a relic of the past. This belief is not an option for social workers. As social workers, we are familiar with the motivations and ideologies behind policies that defund and punish poor communities of color, the victims of decades and centuries of oppressive and limiting policies. We don't need Trump to unmask racism. Part of our job now as anti-racists is to make sure that we recruit the anti-Trump, anti-racist bandwagoners. We need to make sure the world knows that racism didn't leave to hide in Mar-a-Lago when Trump left the White House. We need to highlight the ways that racism continues to be embedded in everyday policies and interactions. We need to question and challenge the assumptions that we make about our clients and be consistent in our analysis of the opportunity structures and limitations that shape outcomes among the most disadvantaged, those who are at risk of being blamed for their positions in society. And of course, we need to start this work by looking at ourselves. Tonight, as you hear from our esteemed panelists, we will be asking these difficult questions about how to weed out racism in our own social work practice and push forward as a stronger, more anti-racist profession in the post-Trump era. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and they are going to introduce themselves, their work, and present on how they view anti-racist practice. So first speaking will be Dr. Robbie Torse.
Hello, I'm very honored to be able to speak here this evening on this momentous day. We have a new president, and hopefully we will have a new sense of what we can do to bring about a change in our social setting. I'm a retired professor from Boston College Graduate School of Social Work. My post-retirement, I have been an adjunct at Simmons University, Salem, and Bridgewater State University. I'm published. I presented nationally and internationally. My interests are about collaborative practice between public schools and human service settings. Cultural diversity is also an interest with an emphasis on racism. I also have practiced with children, adults, and groups. I've led and co-led seminars, workshops on diversity in public and private settings. Currently, I'm a member of the Center for the Study of Diversity and Social Change, and we publish, present, and develop CE courses. My racial identity has been shaped and out of where I grew up. I grew up in a segregated South. And I think my generation is the last generation that was totally engulfed in a Jim Crow environment. We were the sit-inners, the freedom riders, and the ones who helped during the civil rights era. Coming north to graduate school, I realized that racism wasn't just a Southern problem, that racism existed even here in the North. A little more subtle, but was here. I also learned, because in the South it was either Black or white back then, or Native American, that there was a lot of ethnocentrism that existed here as well. These things shaped my practice. Social justice is a broad concept that suggests equality. One pejorative action that is consistently present and woven into all social justice arenas is racism. Racism is the dominant thread and influences the progress of all social justice causes. Racism, therefore, is infused within the foundational areas of social work practice. It also assaults our basic social work populations, some of which you see here. Social workers represent a microcosm of the broader society. Therefore, our work in support of clients has been scaffolded, or we could say built, reinforced, developed by social norms, values, and a misdirected heritage that is deeply rooted in systemic racism. Next. Vygotsky, a developmental psychologist, suggests that developmentally, scaffolding is advanced by continual growth and reinforcement of values, ideas, and behaviors that surround us as we grow up. One of the societal constructs that is reinforced through a developmentally scaffolding process is that of systemic racism. Two colleagues and myself conceptualized a racist scaffolding phenomenon that is constructed of oppressive poles and lungs. We've all seen scaffolding. Could you go to the next, please? I'm sorry. Okay, next. And that these poles and rungs of scaffolding are just like the scaffolding that you see being erected around buildings that are being built. These rungs and poles, as I noted, are oppressive. The initial scaffolding poles are anchored and represent methods of racial oppression, as noted on this slide in blue. In reality, more poles can be included that can further strengthen the depth and breadth of racism, especially in this current era of oppressive systems and social unrest. Scaffold racist thoughts next, and social supports historically were embraced and legalized. And I emphasize the word legalized because racism has been embedded into all of the structural systems that we have. These historical positions and structures remain and have also morphed in order to embrace, adapt to, and interface with contemporary systemic racism in societal changes. The scaffolding rungs that connect to and stabilize the poles, therefore, foster the continued evolution of racism by means of the conceptual representations you see here in blue. Next, the impact and influence of these poles and rungs, in fact, shape social work practice and social workers. Next. Systemic racist scaffolding becomes more complex when we consider the multidimensional subsets that our clients must navigate, which you see examples of here on this particular slide. One essence for being is consistently under attack by these intersections, which are imbued with racism and the racial perceptions by others within society, including social workers. Next, to a greater or lesser degree, we have all inculcated the thought processes that support inequitable policies that are based on racist scaffolding. For example, as people of color, do we express to our administrators or white colleagues clear or veiled discord about what might adversely impact the work that we do with our clients, or do we stay silent? As whites, do we express clear attitudes that indicate a sense of better than or paternalism that reinforce a culture of white supremacy? So how do we create a better environment? We know that in the past and even now that we live in a racist society. How can we work in our settings and with our clients to make things better? One way is to establish this change through embracing, as you have already heard, through an anti-racism construct by deleting racist policies, systems, views, and behaviors. It means creating equality. Next. Equality itself can be inequitable if we do not properly analyze the client situation and balance, and I emphasize balance, the need for true client parity, equity, and justice. As we see in the pictures to the right, that equality is there in the first picture, but you can't say that everyone has the exact same capacity to reach the position that perhaps they would like. Whereas in the second picture, to the far right, you see that equity is a better chance. There is an opportunity for everyone to reach the product that they, in fact, are trying to get, if they so desire and if they have the capacity. So equity is what we are striving for, not just equality. We're striving for a balanced, equitable system. And so how do we create such a system? As noted before, we need an anti-racist environment. This requires national, state, local, community, organizational settings. Next, identifying balanced, equitable policies and systems that will accommodate the myriad of marginalized groups within a white supremacy culture. Next, please. It requires understanding that societal and organizational policies, systems, and values play a part in how we respond to and assist our clients. And it requires recognizing that anti-racist policies, systems, and values seek to balance equitable existences that expunge systemic racism. Next, creating an anti-racist environment requires in beliefs that have been fostered, for example, by a denial, sense of denial, and a sense of elitism being the best. Next, therefore, in creating an anti-racist environment, it is important that as social workers, we are aware of our personal values and beliefs and ensure they are concurrent with the values and beliefs of our profession. Because if those two things aren't together, there is a disconnect, which means that there will be a disconnect in our agency environments as well as with the work that we do with our clients. Clients deserve fairness and equity of service. Anti-racism practice, therefore, requires ongoing communication and continuously tackling unequal policies, systems, values, and behaviors, which corrupt the equitable balance that provides clients the just service they deserve. This was a brief and very broad snapshot of what is needed in our work. And it's based on what can be done in terms of galvanizing our country against racism and how we can stimulate an environment that is anti-racist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torse. All right, next we'll be hearing from Dr. Judith Willison.
Greetings. I'm honored to be here tonight with everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my racial identity journey, my journey toward and in and with racial justice, and share some thoughts with you through my own experiences. So I have been a professor of social work at Bridgewater State University for 10 years. Before that, I was a forensic social worker in the adult and juvenile legal systems, working in prisons and juvenile detention facilities, providing mental health and substance abuse services. I was a clinician, a supervisor, a trainer, a program administrator, and tried to be an advocate. But that was hard to do within the confines of the criminal legal system, and I'll tell you more about that later. Throughout my career of practicing, I also really enjoyed teaching as an adjunct professor at various schools of social work. And after 18 years after I got my MSW, I decided to go back to school part-time to get my PhD so that I could teach full-time. And then when I finished, eventually, it took me a long time, I started at Bridgewater. So after I finished my PhD, I realized what privileges a PhD affords someone. I'd been teaching at Smith School of Social Work for about 9 years without any notice. But the moment I finished my PhD, I was asked almost immediately to be a keynote speaker at their summer institute. I was pleased. I got to choose the topic, and I chose to talk about the role of racism and classism in mass incarceration. For the first time, I felt like I could fully engage in community-based consciousness raising and advocacy. I embraced this role wholeheartedly, and it was very liberating. So I've tried to continue to do that work. I became more involved in community work around anti-racist efforts through the NASW-MA Racial Justice Council and the Criminal Justice Committee. Through my teaching practices, through my work at Bridgewater, which has focused on recruiting and retaining Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC faculty and students, and supporting BIPOC students in their trajectories, in their educational trajectories. Through this process, I have worked to examine and change policies and practices that reflect white supremacist culture, both in organizations and in direct social work practice. And I really needed to gain a lot of knowledge and a lot of skills in facilitating uncomfortable conversations about race and racism. I've become more able to share my own mistakes, my challenges, and to show up in an increasingly more authentic way in the work. One thing for sure about my experiences in anti-racism work is I am continually learning and needing to take a deeper look at my positionality in the work and dismantling years of training that we all get in white supremacist culture. My research is focused on understanding criminalized behaviors within socio-political contexts, including institutional racism. It's based in the anti-oppressive principles of feminist participatory action research in collaboration with formerly incarcerated women. I strive to also invite formerly incarcerated people into collaboration in my teaching and community advocacy work, and I've learned invaluable lessons from people with lived experiences of institutional racism in the criminal legal system. In order to promote anti-racist social work education and practice, I'm also co-authoring a textbook titled Anti-Oppressive Social Work in the Carceral State. And I'll talk more later about what I think anti-oppressive social work practice is. I also have the great honor of providing trainings and consultation, primarily as part of a biracial dyad with a friend and colleague who identifies as Black, on anti-oppressive social work practice, racial justice, culturally responsive social work practice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to organizations like the Department of Children and Families, other mental health organizations, and community groups. And it's incredibly inspiring and humbling to be witness to social workers' tireless efforts to move toward racial justice in their organizations and in their direct practice. I was raised in a white, culturally Jewish family of educators who were involved in the civil rights movement. I went to public city schools with racially, ethnically diverse student bodies, and my family included people of color in their social circle. My family taught me that everyone deserved human and civil rights. And yet, I was not schooled in what white supremacy is. I was not schooled in the advantages I have from structural racism because I am white. I was not schooled in how systemic racism is manifested in every institution, in many of our laws, and in policies and practices in this country. So like most white people, I had to intentionally decide to step outside my whiteness in order to begin my journal of racial identity development. It was really slow at first, and I struggled. When I started to realize the magnitude of white supremacy and the genocide, hatred, and violence visited on Indigenous and Black people in this country over our history, honestly, I wanted to not be white. I wanted to disown my racial identity. I felt shame and deep sadness and mounting outrage. And I still do, of course, but I worked to move beyond that since that's all about my feelings. And in reality, what's important is understanding the material legacy of our racist history. So I worked to use my white advantages as best I could, and I do try to use these to dismantle racism. In my racial identity journey, one of the most important things that happened is I found community. I found allies. I found people to journey with me and to hold me accountable for moving forward. These collaborators are a crucial component of the recipe that allows me to continue this work. I chose to step outside the confines of economic and racial segregation that bind many of us, and to find a home in a racially integrated neighborhood, to build deep relationships across racial differences that have sustained me over many, many years. These relationships, along with my own continual learning, have allowed me to better understand a little bit about what it's like to be a person of color living in a white supremacist culture. And most importantly, to better understand what role I can play in anti-racism work. I conceptualize anti-racism work as a political commitment to dismantling the white supremacist institutions and culture that American history lays at our feet. And social work is the only helping profession wherein we have an ethical obligation to social justice. So in my mind, this is a central pillar of our work as social workers. I believe that anti-racism work also requires a series of very personal commitments. This is different for each and every one of us, but it does include a commitment to be self-reflective as much as I can about my own racial privileges, my role in white supremacy culture, and my own implicit biases. It includes pushing myself out of my comfort zone and constantly questioning social structures that perpetuate systemic and interpersonal racism and examining how I might be contributing to them, even though I don't want to be contributing to them. So I've been lucky enough to have so many more opportunities since joining full-time academia and community-based work to engage in anti-racism work. I can use a racial justice lens and emphasis in all aspects of my work now. Racial justice and anti-racism work reflect both a fundamental value of mine and part of my identity at this point. Racial justice, in my mind, is about human rights. And my life and the lives of those I care about and love are intimately affected by racial injustice. Anti-racism work is a process. I'm always learning, and many times I stumble. I make mistakes. I'll tell you about some of those tonight. I get tired, and my community helps me get back up and try again, and I find a new way forward. I am deeply humbled by the generosity and care in my community of allies and co-conspirators in racial justice work. I look forward to telling you more about my journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Willison. And next, our next panelist is Rebecca Jackson.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy and honored to be able to be with you tonight. I'm particularly humbled to be participating on this panel with Dr. Willison, who I'm proud to say has become a friend after she was a professor at the end of my social work education. And I can personally attest to her journey and where she is as a white person and doing anti-racist work and trying to live an anti-racist life. So particularly honored to be a part of this with her. So I am lucky enough to be able to get to do racial justice work as my actual job. I work for Trinity Boston Connects. I manage and run a program called Organizational Equity Practice that helps organizations to incorporate racially equitable, trauma-inclusive, and restorative justice practices into their daily functioning. So we support leaders, we support groups of staff, we help people develop policies and structures and procedures to make their organizations more equitable. Before, I've been at Trinity for about 8 years. I started off as a clinician, and that's my background. I went to Simmons. I finished at Simmons in 2009. And for the first few years of my career, mostly focused on doing individual and group trauma work, and worked in various communities, mostly in Boston, in the inner city, quote unquote, and working with families and communities of color. But I came into social work with a background in teaching. I was a pastor for a few years and lost a member of my church to community violence. And so that prompted me to go to social work school. But even before that, as I think about my own racial identity journey, I am a Black woman who is privileged to have two parents who are still married after 50 years and who both have graduate degrees. My father is a lawyer, or educated to be a lawyer. He's a pastor now. And my mother has a master's degree in education in library science, both from Simmons. And I grew up in a white neighborhood and I went to white schools. I went to private schools for part of my education, but I went to church in the city. So when I went to school, I was around a lot of white people. And when I went to church, I was around a lot of other Black people. And I really didn't have an analysis about my own privilege, why I lived in a suburb, why my parents had cars, why I lived in a house that had a pool, and why the people that I went to church with did not have that same privilege. I didn't understand that until I went to grad school. What I did understand was that I was different. I understood that my hair was different. I understood that there were other things about me that were different, that sometimes I talked different. And that we didn't really discuss that. We didn't talk about it much at home. We didn't talk about it much at school or in other places. It was just something that we all knew and recognized. And when I got to grad school and started to understand my own privilege as a young Black woman that had college educated parents and grew up thinking that higher education was just something that I was going to naturally do, and was really humbled by that privilege. You know, part of the definition of privilege from my perspective is we didn't earn it. So I was just born into a family that has lots and lots and lots of flaws, but happened to have those sort of points in my favor that set me up in a particular way. And really what I wanted to do was talk about it. I wanted to talk about race. I wanted to talk about the fact that many of my colleagues were fellow students were white, and they were coming to class talking about clients and not naming their race, but they were mostly Black, they were mostly people of color. And it was important to me to really start to talk about that. And that's still part of what I do. And although I would not define racial justice as having a conversation, I do think that it is a first step, is just being able to name it, being able to name the ways that race and our racial identity are impacting our decisions, that they're impacting the way that we see one another, impacting the way that we interact one another, thinking about the types of systems that I work in. They're impacting who gets promoted, who is seen as a good leader, who is seen as having potential, who is seen as being a good fit. That all of those things are part of how we were socialized into a white supremacist perspective, the people of color as well as white people, because that's the way this country works. This country was founded on white supremacy. And so it's the water that we've all been swimming in. So part of being able to dismantle that is starting to name it and identify it and have conversations about it, and then begin to put processes and structures in place that can help hold us accountable and make sure that we are actually living out a different way. I think one of the things that we talk about a lot in my work is what does sustainable change require? One part of that is hearts and minds, that we have to think differently and we have to start to feel differently. But the other two parts are behaviors and structures. So what are we doing? What is our action? What are our action steps? How do we make sure that they are aligned with the way that we're thinking and what's in our hearts and our purpose and our vision and our motivation? And also, what are the structures that are going to hold us accountable, as Dr. Torst was talking about, for creating a different type of environment? For me, the work that I do is personal. I work for nonprofit organizations, and I'm a young, not that young, I'm a Black woman who has had the privilege in particular over the past 8 years of being able to move forward in an organization and feel like I can be my authentic self. And that is not the case. There are lots of people that I see working in nonprofits, people of color. I was just with someone today who was talking, a young Black man who was talking about the fact that he just found out a friend of his was killed and felt like he couldn't take the day off of work, felt like his white female boss was going to look askance at him if he asked for another day off after he had already taken a day off and after a holiday weekend. And that type of harm and trauma that many folks of color are experiencing on a day-to-day basis when we're in this field trying to make the world a better place for people who look like us and therefore for everyone else. I firmly believe that if we make our organizations and our institutions, if we structure them in keeping in mind the most vulnerable person, that we're making it better for everyone. So who is the most vulnerable, the most marginalized person in your organization? If you plan for them and if you structure according to them, everybody else benefits. And so helping to create nonprofits and organizational structures where people feel safe and they feel like they can be their authentic selves, and then they can bring their full selves to the work, and that those places are healing places and not places that are simply perpetuating the trauma that folks of color are experiencing just in our day-to-day lives, just existing as a person of color in this country. As we've seen, I don't think we've begun yet to see the healing that we all need to do just to recover from the hypervigilant state that we've been in for the past 4 years. And that's individual, and that's also a collective work that needs to happen. But we don't want our nonprofits to be perpetuating that. We want them to be spaces of healing where people can be healed and whole. And I look forward to talking about that more as we continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing. And last, we have Felicia Kanu.
Hi everyone, my name is Felicia Kanu. Sorry, let's see. Like I said, my name is Felicia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently a graduate student at Smith College, pursuing a degree in social work. I am honored for the opportunity to speak and give my perspective as a student. Currently, you know, in a school that had a anti-racism commitment. So Smith College currently has decided to pause their commitment to one, sorry, losing my train of thought. Sorry. So I'm currently at Smith College. So the anti-racism commitment and that idea is actually coming to head a lot at my school right now. A lot of the BIPOC students, especially for people part of Council for Students of Color, have been constantly demanding for change at Smith College, which is also why the commitment has been put to pause, because many of the students feel that commitment has not been adequately upheld. So, and which then goes into what is a proper anti-racist world or practice. It's not enough just to put a commitment and say, yes, we do this, we do that. You have to make sure you're actively doing it, and you need to make sure you're always being, what's that word? I forgot the word, but it's like in the future. Like you need to be making sure you're trying to prevent and minimize harm in the future as best as you can. Cool. So my racial identity, for me, oh, what happened? Oh, okay, sorry. For me, what Robbie talked about during her racial identity aspect really hit home to me, because in many ways, how racism is shown is changed. I grew up in a relatively multicultural world. So for me, my first initial experience with racism didn't occur until college. That's when I was able to get that proper education and understanding of what are microaggressions, what are macroaggressions, and actually have words to describe the harm that has been placed on me. Because a lot of the racism has transformed, which is also what makes it very insidious, how racism is. Let us see. So while in college, I decided to pursue a minor in Afro-American Studies to further my education, because prior to that, most of my education was very whitewashed. It was not inclusive of all of the proper foundational aspects that would help me actually see, why is racism still here? What is the problem, and why is it still here? So for me, I think I already mentioned this already, but for me, the anti-racism perspective should be active. You need to be actively doing it. It's not enough to just be like, yes, I'm anti-racist. Yes, I love all people, but are you putting the energy? Because we are now in 2021, and people's lives are dying. People are dying. They're actively being harmed because we're not doing enough. And that's just the truth, the reality. And we're not doing enough in various components. For me, when I think of a proper anti-racism world, it would involve an ecological model approach, where you're not just focusing on just one aspect or maybe two or three. You need to make sure you're focusing on all components. And then, so it should probably be obvious for many of you. I already identified myself as Black, but my commitment or my desire for anti-racism is very personal. There are many different aspects of how racism impacts me, both in an individual model and in a more organizational and structural model. Individually, it's like my maternal mental health. Like if I end up pregnant, I have a higher risk of dying, just for the sole fact that I'm a woman and I'm also Black in the US. It also impacts me with my other peers, my other fellow Black people, and how we see each other, because of how white supremacy is so insidious and goes into every aspect. Like even within the Black community, unfortunately, white supremacy is so strong in there that within ourselves we are harming each other at times, because we're either upholding or maintaining the white supremacy ideologies, whether intentionally or not intentionally. And sorry, I should have mentioned this before. I do have a habit of like, it's a struggle, but I hope everyone is given grace, because everyone has different backgrounds, and one of my background struggles is that I sometimes lose my train of thought, so please work with me. So for me, some key personable actions that I can do, but also other people can do, is making sure you're staying educated. What other panelists have said, what I'm saying is that the current education model is not it wasn't adequate. It wasn't adequate to what we need in this world to make sure we're actually anti-racist. Luckily, we do have technology, which does makes it easier for us to access, but it also means that many people are maybe focusing on other type of electronic content and so on, when they could be focusing more on specifically BIPOC content, BIPOC being Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So make sure that you're actually getting resources and sources from the source, from marginalized people. Something that kind of upset me, I'm happy it got out there, but like oh, I forgot the name of the author, unfortunately, but I'm pretty sure the title was White Fragility or something like that, or something of the context from a white author. But her book blew up this summer. I think it was like 2 years old, but you have a lot of content from BIPOC people who've been talking about the issue with white people either being complacent, white supremacy, but their content is not blowing up. So that's something that also you need to take personally. Make sure that you are being comfortable taking in the content that BIPOC people are facing from us. Don't get defensive. Embrace the fact that we're telling you we've harmed you. Yes, Robin DiAngelo, and so on. So like that's something really important to remember. Another huge thing to take in personally is make sure that you're combating. Like you need to be combating racism at all aspects. Your friends and family, you can't keep the peace. This is not a time to be keeping the peace, keeping love and joy. No, this is a time to be combating and fighting so that we can end this as quickly and swiftly as possible, because being an ally is not being comfortable. And also you're doing a disservice for yourself, your friends and your loved ones, because you're not working and fighting for a better world. And also self-reflection. I noticed that for some people, they're not taking enough time to just sit down. They feel like maybe sometimes they've done so many years of work, they've done all this research, they go to all these seminars. Everyone can make mistakes. I can make mistakes, I can goof, I may say something weird here. You need to embrace the fact that you're self-reflecting constantly and take the feedback from other people when they're telling you you're either not up to par or up to speed with the current ideologies that are necessary to fight an anti-racist, to fight a racist world, or so on. And then professionally, like I said, I'm a student. So as a student, there has been various opportunities for me to involve myself in an anti-racist world, whether that's outside the university setting. I don't have much outside work experience. I've mostly been in the higher learning format. So a lot of my pursuit for anti-racist world has been within the university setting. And that's something I really want to highlight for any of the students, but not just the students, the faculty, other social workers in the audience. You need to be making sure that you're fighting for anti-racist commitment within your school, because even within the social work practice, it's very racist. Its foundation, its background is very racist, and we can also do better. So do not think that just because you're a not a racist, just do not think just because you're a social worker doesn't absolve you from either racist or upholding and maintaining white supremacy. And I also want to give a quick shout out for the NASW. I think it's NYS. They're hosting an event tomorrow night that talks about like just because you're a social worker doesn't absolve you from being a racist. So definitely check that out. And I think I'm done with my introduction.
All right, thank you so much, Felicia, and all the panelists. Thank you. That was such a incredible combination of personal stories and narratives, and then also professional and critical insights about racism and anti-racism. So thank you for sharing about yourselves and your work. Next, what we're going to do is I have a list of questions for the panelists, and we'll be able to go through some of those questions. And also, we're keeping track of questions from the audience. I have a list of that as well. So we'll start with questions that we have written for the panelists, and then we'll move on to audience questions. So, all right, all our panelists are here. The first question we have, based on your experiences so far, how does racism show up in social work practice?
I think it's going in the same order.
I think it shows in social work practice. Can you hear me?
Okay, I think it shows up in social work practice in the way we relate to our clients, in the way that the agency culture manifests itself to the workers as well as to the clients that come to a particular agency. And it does not take clients long to understand and to pick up on the nuances that are reflected by workers and by the agency. So I think it's important that we are aware of who we are, what we think, and how can we, in fact, better ourselves to better work with our clients and within the agency environment.
And I think that's so true, Dr. Tuis. And I guess the thing that I would add to that is that one of the ways that it shows up is in the leadership structures of our agencies.
Yes.
I often say to my students that I'm always cautious about a white person with a good idea from a distance. And a lot of times our nonprofits have been created by white people who had ideas about how to solve problems in communities of which they are not a part, that they may be visited. And that's problematic. And then they create these organizations out of good intention, no ill will, but uninformed and disconnected, and then perpetuate that within the structure. So it's often the folks of color who are on the ground doing the work, but it's white people who are disconnected from the folks that we're serving who are leading and therefore making decisions about what the work looks like and what new ideas we're going to have and what new programs we're going to create. And so I think even when there are people on the ground who are trying to move in ways that are equitable and anti-racist, they're often pushing back against organizational structures that are perpetuating the very problems that our nonprofits purport to try to solve.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, Rebecca, I think that part of what happens is we, especially white social workers, have a model of doing to clients, of doing to communities, instead of working with communities. And I know I had to unlearn that. So we're not necessarily taught an anti-racist frame in social work school. And there are some things we have to actually unlearn because our profession is professionalized. That pushes us to be very committed to the structures and bureaucracies and hierarchies that create the jobs within which we work. So in our field, there's this fundamental conflict between providing services to those in need and pushing for change in all of the socio-political policies and structures that create inequity and create the need in the first place. And there's this tension between our role of social control, when you think about, DCF and the criminal legal system, and social change. So we really need to be interrogating this in our own social work practice, since we work, as you all are saying, within organizations and systems that manifest white supremacy and institutional racism. I know I had to really learn not from social workers, from civil rights attorneys, from activists, from racial justice people. I had to learn how the criminal legal system enacted structural, institutional, and interpersonal racism. I didn't learn that in school, and I wasn't learning it from my supervisors. I had to step outside social work to learn that.
Hi again. Yeah, I'm just a giggly person. I'm sorry, I can't help control that. But for me, again, from the student perspective, I don't, because again, I haven't graduated, haven't fully worked as a social worker. But for me, it's, I see a lot of the racism showing up in, I'm gonna give like 4 different categories. One of them is being the professors. So for white professors or people who are either upholding or maintaining white supremacy, these professors are either not managing the classroom properly or the curriculum is not focused on an anti-racism mindset. So that's one issue. Sometimes that's the actual professor's fault, sometimes that's the actual faculty and administration fault. It's a combination. And then another thing I've noticed is that a lot of BIPOC professors because of their connections with other marginalized identities, they're working harder. They're expending more energy to compensate for the fact that either the administration, school, or white professors are not doing enough, which is unfortunate because then they're gonna burn out, they're gonna burn out faster. And unfortunately, there's also not enough BIPOC professors in the first place. I already touched on
but I'm sorry, but I think that goes back to what Rebecca was saying about leaders being accountable for the culture in which their agencies operate.
Yes, exactly. And then some other things I want to highlight is the administration, which I already kind of touched upon. If that administration is not being held accountable, that's also going to relate down or trickle down to the students and the professors. It also really applies to agencies. So a lot of the social work programs, we are now sending interns out into all different places, all different social work practices. And sometimes the supervisors are not trained adequately to either manage their own micro and macroaggressions or other macro and microaggressions that the BIPOC students might be experiencing them own selves. But even with the white social workers, when they're coming in, they have non-white clients. How are they handling those microaggressions with that? And then another thing that's also racist for me is access. There's a huge wealth gap, unfortunately, for a lot of BIPOC students that makes internships really hard, like actually internships that would maybe really take them to the next level. They can't often do those ones because they either have to work towards 3 other jobs, other time commitments that then require extra labor on their behalf because of that whole wealth gap. Also elitism. I noticed with higher academia, there's a lot of elitism, which is also rooted in racism, which is an issue. I'll stop for now.
No, so that's terrific. And that, Felicia, what you said actually transitions well into our next question, which is how can social workers confront their own biases and prejudices when working with clients or communities that have a racial or ethnic identity different than their own? I think you mentioned, right, microaggressions in a clinical context. So what can social workers do to learn to be able to confront their own biases in those situations?
Well, I feel like maybe I should kick this off because I'm the white person in the room. And it's usually us white people. Not that it doesn't happen with BIPOC folks too, but we struggle certainly with addressing our own biases and prejudices when we're working with people who are BIPOC. And one of the things I think about that's so important is that we white people are generally not taught to speak openly about race and racism. That means we have to learn, and it's up to us to learn, to figure out how to learn. And BIPOC folks learn very early on that it's not safe to share their experiences of racism and racial stress with us because they can't trust us. They have reason not to trust us. So because we are and we perpetuate racist systems such as taking kids away from families, kids of color disproportionately, corralling people of color into the criminal legal system, et cetera, the school to prison pipeline. So I know for me, I had to realize that I had to get comfortable during these uncomfortable conversations. And I had to realize that discomfort was part of my growth, and that because I am part of the dominant oppressive racial group, because I'm white, how could I communicate to BIPOC clients that I was trying to work against racism and that I was trying to see and understand and dismantle racism? And I feel like we need to actively communicate our understanding of the complex nature of racism to clients and colleagues and coworkers so that we can communicate that we understand we represent the dominant oppressive group that's been inflicting harm. So I think part of what happened for me was I learned how to use self-disclosure about my own struggles with being white in a white supremacist system, and to share that with clients and coworkers, and to share some vulnerability, and to say things like, to indicate that I was open to these conversations, to say things like, I've been very upset about the recent killing of unarmed Black people by police, or disparities in how COVID impacts communities of color, fill in the blank, various manifestations of structural racism, trying to name structural and interpersonal racism and its devastating effects. I say things like, I'm really working on trying to talk about race and racism, and I want to learn about your racial experiences and your experiences of racism. Sometimes I'm uncomfortable because I have advantages and privileges because I'm a white person. I'm trying to acknowledge this and not contribute unintentionally to structural racism. I ask clients and asked others, BIPOC folks, about their experiences of microaggressions and racism so that I could be able to understand them better and to listen carefully for opportunities to talk about race and racism in our practice with clients and with organizations. This is part of cultural responsiveness and cultural humility, but unfortunately, we're not often taught exactly how to share and open those conversations. So the more vulnerable I made myself, so that the client is the only person in the room being vulnerable and talking about their vulnerabilities, it diffuses the power differential a little bit, and I try to open doors to those conversations. And that allows me to combat my own prejudices and stereotypes and biases that I might be having.
And I think that's something that you said, Judith, is also really important about like community and accountability, because I think sometimes with one of the things that I see a lot in nonprofits is white people not initiating the conversation, not naming it. I just did some work with an organization and they got really low rates on this statement about leaders naming, proactively addressing issues of race, power, identity, and privilege. And I had to sort of walk them through, here's how you can do that. In conversation, you can say, my whiteness might be at play here. I know that because I'm white, this might feel a little bit different. And it wasn't that they weren't thinking about it, they just weren't naming it. And because they weren't naming it, the folks of color and other folks that they were interacting with weren't receiving it that way. And that sometimes, though, there's an over-reliance on folks of color sharing and teaching. And I think having other, for white people anyway, having other white people is really, really important. Other white people, a colleague of mine calls it phone a white friend, other white people that you can call to say, I think I might have messed up. I had this interaction. I think I might have missed something. And to then be able to go back to the person of color without expecting that they have to bring it back to you, but you have some other, people in your life who can help keep you accountable. And I think one of the things that perpetuates, one of the dynamics, the structural dynamics in our country that perpetuates racism is segregation. And so many of the white people that I work with in organizations don't have any friends of color. They don't actually have personal relationships outside of work with other people of color. So they don't have people who love them enough and trust them enough to say, don't. And that's important. It's important to have those types of relationships so that the people of color at your job are not the only, especially when you're in a position of leadership. You can't lean on, it's not fair to lean on folks of color who report to you to teach you about your racism. So having some communities of accountability for white people, and there's, I have made lots of mistakes about trans folks, about folks with disabilities. There's a lot of privilege that I have, and I need to have other people in my life who have some of those identities. And I do have other people in my life that I can go to and say, I think I might have fucked up. Tell me if I did, without costing that particular person to tell that story to me or to keep me accountable in that way. I have other ways to stay accountable in other relationships. And I think that's really, really, really important.
Such a good point, Rebecca. And I know that for us white folks, part of what Robin DiAngelo talks about is that we need to build our stamina and our capacity to engage in racial justice work, because it's going to hurt. We're going to feel guilty. We're going to feel badly. And we have to get through that and move on and keep doing it. And to have people in my life who love me and care about me enough, with whom I can have genuine conversations, both white and BIPOC people, it's everything to me. it makes it possible for me to do the work. And when I have turned to some white folks in the past who have then not challenged me, who have said, oh no, it's not you, you're doing the best you can, it's the other person, not helpful. I really do need people to say, yeah, you did, you messed up, and here's why, and here's what you need to do, and let's talk it through. And so you need people with whom you can get real.
I think it's important too to look at the other side, that when we are the sort of presenters or the person who is conducting a workshop or a seminar, and everyone else in the room is white, that we make ourselves very vulnerable. We are vulnerable to their pushback, and sometimes their collusion in not wanting to deal with the issue. They will then focus on the presenter and not deal in a way that they should. So this type of pushback, we as presenters have to steel ourselves against and try to find a way to work through that pushback that they provide us, or give us. I shouldn't say provide us, that they give to us.
And I agree with you 1000%. I have definitely gotten some feedback from students, especially teaching the racism course, that was not about the course or the content. And I even had a semester a couple years ago where I had one class that was majority folks of color and one class that was majority white. And my sort of rating in the majority folks of color class was higher. And the person who was, going over my evaluation said, I noticed that you had sort of different scores. And I was like, it's because the other class was majority folks of color, and white people are just more critical of professors of color. And it shows up in different ways. As students, they can be sometimes they can be a little clandestine. It doesn't always come out directly. It does sometimes come out directly, but workshops, classrooms. And for me, that's why I found it really important. And Judith is really the first person who shared this concept with me, to do biracial dyads. I run a program that is mostly people of color. Up until 6 months ago was all women of color. And we brought in white people to do our white supremacy culture 101 trainings with us. And we'll turn to them when a white person asks a question, and it's like, they do the white supremacy culture framework setup. We don't do that. Like, you don't pay me enough to argue with white people about racism. That's not what I'm here to do. So as much as possible, having other white people who I trust. I mean, that's really important. Not white people who are going to sort of poo-poo or dismiss or miss things, which they do sometimes. But that for me has really been a saving grace to being able to stay in this work, is having white people in my life and immediately in my circle who I trust, who can do the work with me and who can handle some of the white nonsense, as I call it, that often comes up.
I think most of the things that I was gonna say was probably already kind of mentioned. But I just want to echo again, like what you call it, supporting BIPOC creators and content makers, listening to them, getting comfortable listening to them. And if you end up, or if you're in like an agency setting and you're reaching out to maybe one or two few BIPOC people in your agency, make sure you're compensating them if you're asking them for questions or for support. Like, don't just like go and be like, I want to make sure the agency is better, and like you think like that's going to be bettering for them. No, that's extra labor. Make sure you're compensating them for that, for sure. And then also, I did mention it before a little bit, but pretty much make sure that like white supremacy, yes, benefits white people the most, but it's also upheld by a lot of people who are also not white. So social workers, BIPOC social workers, you need to also be confronting yourself to be seen if you are upholding and maintaining white supremacy ideologies, because you're also hindering the movement. So make sure you're checking yourself for that.
Thank you. All right, so this is a tough question. In an ideal world, what does anti-racist social work practice look like? And do you have any examples of current anti-racist social work practice?
Well, since I'm retired, I can't say that I am involved in any practice at this point in my life, but I am involved in a what I often call the think tank that I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks. And what we try to focus on, being a center that looks at diversity and social change, is how, and we've been focusing on leaders, leadership in organizations, and what we try to focus on is how to bring about cultural change in organizations through looking at leaders and what can be done to assist leaders in that effort. I'm just going to leave it at that at this moment.
Yes, oh, Rebecca, go ahead.
Thanks, Judith. I think that anti-racism is a journey. I mean, there's actions that we can and should be taking. And I think there's always, in this country, there's always going to be work to do. And so to me, when I think of sort of in ideal, or, organizational setting or whatever, it's a place where people are asking questions and doing hard work and interrogating themselves, and a place where people are looking to align and actively working to align their structures with their mission, and their behavior with what they say is in their hearts. And sometimes that means, and I have seen this, sometimes that means stepping aside. Sometimes it means white leaders stepping aside and making room for leaders of color. Sometimes it means taking pay cuts and making sure that people are paid fairly in your organization. Sometimes it means redistributing the way you're redistributing your budget and making sure that you have enough in the budget for people's professional development. And it's about aligning your actions. And I've seen lots of different examples of this in my own organization, which is now a majority POC and POC-led organization, and I see the ways in which we've grown and we've stretched, and I think it's also about, from a structural perspective, I think it's also about making room for people to push up, so that people know that there's room for them to be able to bring their concerns, because there's always going to be stuff happening, and that there is attention that's being paid to that, and that there's work being done to that people aren't being dismissed. And that people come to work, again, thinking from a sort of an agency context, that people do feel like, I mean, it can sound so hokey, but that people feel like they can really be themselves at work, that they don't have to leave their burqa at home, that they don't have to, mute themselves when they're laughing, that if it's culturally sort of appropriate for them to say all the time, that they feel like they can do that, and that they're not going to be passed over for a promotion or, looked at sideways, that a place where people feel like they can bring their authentic selves, and then that's actually welcomed. And when that translates into action and structure, then that is naturally going to be a more equitable environment.
I would support both Rebecca and Dr. Torres in what they've said in terms of organizational change and policy and practice change. That makes anti-racist social work. And so we need to create racial justice committees and task forces, and we need to institutionalize practices that lead us to examine policies and to change policies, and to see how policies that appear on the surface to be mainstream are disadvantaging BIPOC employees and BIPOC clients. So one of the models that has really helped me in the last, I guess, about 9 years is something called anti-oppressive social work practice. And I'm happy to share a couple of textbook titles in the chat. It's an anti-racist, feminist, liberatory, anti-oppressive model. And it's really about all of our work, whether it's with clients or organizations or teaching. It's attending to structural oppression at the same time as helping individuals to change their individual lives. And so you can imagine in my practice with clients in the criminal legal system, there were many occasions where I needed to enact this. I didn't know what it was called back then, but I worked with a young African-American boy who ended up being convicted of murder, and because there was an eyewitness who couldn't tell the difference between young Black boys with freckles. Turned out he was innocent. He was eventually exonerated, but he did 5 years of time for a crime he didn't commit. I was his social worker and therapist. I had to really question my understanding and beliefs about the criminal legal system, about how did things work. Was justice just? And I had to open myself to the possibility of his innocence. And as a white person, I had to talk with him about my whiteness and how it was white people who had locked him up for a crime he didn't commit. So our relationship was, to say the least, complicated, but it allowed me to be able to begin to think about how do I attend to structural oppression simultaneously in individual and group and organizational relationships. So anti-oppressive social work I found really helpful. The last thing I'll say is that I believe anti-racist social work looks like us doing this on the individual level, on the agency level, on the organizational level, and at the community advocacy level, so that we are working around legislation and with policymakers, and that we are listening to BIPOC social workers and BIPOC clients.
I agree with what most of the people on my fellow panelists have already said. Thankful for doing the hard work of me not having to say certain things. Yeah, so I don't really have much to say for this one, really.
Well, that's fine. That's fine. All right, next question, and this is something that we had planned and then also is coming from the audience. What are some of your favorite resources to further one's knowledge and skills related to anti-racism? So this could be suggestions for books, movies, TV shows, podcasts, Instagram accounts, organizations to follow, etc.
Well, I'm going to toot my own horn.
That's right, you better.
I think initially we need to understand where we've come from, the history of this country, to not recognize and acknowledge what the base is for this country means that we would never get beyond looking at and coming to terms with anti-racism. And so I want to suggest that people read the book that my colleagues and I wrote on systemic racism in the United States, with racism as the social construction. And it's been out since 2018. A lot has happened since 2018. But I think the crux of the book gives you a historical understanding of racism in this country and where we might go in the future. And I also had some other readings on my my list, which I don't have in front of me now, but Kendi, I think, is one of your colleagues, Rob. And so I'll just leave it with those two at the moment.
I saw that there was a question about this, about, excuse me, about racial trauma in the book, My Grandmother's Hands, by Resmaa Menakem, I think is a really good, not I think, I know, is a really good book about both the trauma, and this is challenging to say in this particular moment, that white people need healing from racism as well. And from my perspective, and I didn't make this up, but that means acknowledging the history of violence. I mean, I think part of what we saw 2 weeks ago at the Capitol was white people not recognizing each other as perpetrators of violence and therefore underestimating the threat. And if that's not the most twisted form of denial about racism in this country, that white people have been perpetuating violence in this country from the very beginning, but they have not come to grips with their own legacy of violence and the way that that sits in their bodies. I mean, anybody who's seen any of these videos of white women losing their minds about thinking a Black boy took their phone, or, you know, wanting this Black man to stop bird watching, you can see the anxiety. You can see this sort of physical reaction that to me is historical. It's not reality. It's almost like they're having an out-of-body experience. And My Grandmother's Hands, I think, does a really good job of talking about that legacy of violence and what white people can do to really come to terms with that. And he also talks about what Black people can do and the work that we need to do, because the healing that Black people need to do and the healing that white people need to do is very different. But there is work for both of us to do. So that's a book that I would highly recommend.
Yeah, Rebecca just finished it. I second that. Highly recommend it. I think Jamie is putting some of my resources that I recommend in the chat. There's a book about anti-oppressive social work practice, putting theory into action. I also follow the Equal Justice Initiative and the Vera Institute of Justice, which are excellent organizations that attend to racial justice. And racialequitytools.org is a great resource. I use that a lot for trainings and teaching. And then the Social Work Coalition for Anti-Racist Social Work Educators and Students, I find very helpful as well. And there's some other links in the chat that you can check out.
As far as podcasts too, Code Switch is a really good one. The 1619 Project, they made that into a podcast. That was also really good. Nice White Parents is another podcast. Just a few episodes that came out not too well. I think it came out a little while ago. But Code Switch in particular is a good podcast.
Hi everyone, again. So for me, a lot of the content that I consume, so I mean, I was born, you know, in '94. A lot of the things I consume is through technology, either through videos, podcast, or through Facebook. So most of the things that I'm going to be sharing to you are geared towards that. So just be aware. But also understand a lot of the resources I'm going to be providing you are led by BIPOC people. Specifically, most of them Black. That doesn't mean there's not other resources out there, but because I'm Black, most of my resources are led by Black creators. But please understand that just because I list these resources does not mean that you get to come in and demand labor from these creators. Make sure that you're coming in as a guest. You are coming in either ready to compensate, either through energy or through monetary means and so on. And for me, the reason why I want to highlight these resources is also because it's also super important to know the history of racism and all that, but it's also really important to understand the nuances of how it impacts BIPOC people, from how they view themselves through the world, through the color of their skin, how they love one another, how they get their feelings about medicine, vaccinations, voting issues, and all this issue. So all these resources I'm going to list all relate in some way to that. That doesn't mean that everything they say I love, but just know that you should be consuming all kinds of content so that this way you can see different patterns and all these kind of things. So gonna just list them. They, like I said, mix between either Facebook, YouTube, or having their own website. So I have For Harriet. I don't know if can I copy and paste this later? Or can I just copy and paste it on the chat? I mean,
Yes,
I'll still read it out. I don't know how to copy. Oh, I think, no, I don't know how to do it. Okay, but pretty much For Harriet, The Root, The Grapevine, sorry, not Ugly, Uppity Negress Podcast, Son of Baldwin, Angry Black Homo, Josie, Lace Watkins or Lace on Race, and Ali Henny. So these are just some of my few favorite people that I like to either keep me up to date on like how to lead an anti-racist life. And it also encompasses the different things that impact us, because we're more than just here humans. You know, we fall in love, we we go to work, we go to doctors expecting care and then potentially dying because we're not respected. So there's so many things we need to be keeping track of and seeing how it impacts us. And then yeah, that's it, my resources.
Yeah, thank you all for those resources. And then everyone, Jamie is saying that we will be able to send out the resources to everyone. You can also see in the chat that they've been being posted after everyone speaks. So the next question comes from the audience and is very, very timely, right? So we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we have communities due to lack of trust from very real historical experiences with problematic behaviors from the medical community do not have the trust in the medical community and continue to not access behavioral health services or have vaccine hesitancy with regard to COVID. So what can social workers do in order to help ease those trust issues within communities of color that have traumatic histories with the medical profession?
So I'm gonna be vulnerable and honest. I do have some issues with just like listening to things. Is there a way we can like, is that in the chat for me to read the question?
Oh,
Wait,
sorry, I was muted. Yes, I can send it to you right now.
thank you.
One of the first things that comes to mind for me is that it's important for social workers to acknowledge the history of lethal violence inflicted by the white medical community on Black and brown communities. And so that's the first and foremost thing, is to understand the historical legacy of a dangerous medical community. So if we don't know about that, we need to learn about it. And so that's the first thing. And then to be able to have those open and honest conversations with clients about our understanding of that legacy and how we feel it impacts people's decisions now and in the context of the pandemic. And so I would say the next step would be then to share the science around the vaccines and to also ensure that BIPOC clients have a way to access medical services in a medical facility or in a medical office where there are BIPOC providers, which can increase their level of comfort to some extent anyway.
I think Judith's statements just now are on point, and I honestly can't think of anything else to add to that at this moment.
Thank you for those insights. So this is certainly something that I know that a lot of social workers are finding themselves dealing with now, even more than usual, right? All right, the next question is actually 3 questions that are closely related from the audience, and I'm going to read out all 3, and then I'd like the panelists to kind of right. You don't have to address each one as a separate question, but just kind of that answer them as you see fit. So first, is racism complicated to treat because it reflects ingrained patterns of thinking and behavior, similar to personality disorder? And then related to that, when working in a clinical setting, how should social workers address racism from clients directed at their colleagues? And then third, how do we support staff of color treating racist white clients? We often teach white people how to work with people of color, but we neglect to teach people of color how to work with white people. And so I'm asking those together because I think that something that social workers often struggle with is when you're dealing with someone in crisis, how do you decide when it is appropriate to take the time to stop and say, wait a second, I'm seeing some racism here, and how do we intervene there? But if a client is in crisis, then that means that you may not feel like you have time because you have to deal with more kind of a life or death issue first. And so how do we think about intervening in racism with our clients in that way?
Well, let me start off with this, because when I started practicing, it was back in the mid 70s, early 70s. And there were fewer people of color in this area at that time. And all of my clients at an agency where I worked in Cambridge were white. I had to start out each time I met someone by discussing race. What did it mean to them? What did it mean for them to have me as a practitioner working with them in being white? There were times when the conversations were very fruitful, and in the end, we were able to make progress. I can also give you an example of a case when I was doing what Felicia is doing now. I was a graduate student, and I worked at my second year placement was at Mass General in child psych and pediatrics, and I saw the mother, and the psychiatrist saw the child at that time. And the mother would come in every week, and it was winter. She would have her coat on, she would have her hat on, her gloves on, etc. And she would give me monosyllable responses. I said, gee, what am I going to do with her? And I'd go back to my supervisor. We'd talk about it. She said, oh, well, try this, try that. So I'd go back the next week, and I'd try this, and I'd try that. And the same thing would happen. Monosyllable responses, never took a coat off, never took a hat off, never took gloves off. And finally, one week I decided to just come out and say, look, I'm Black, you're white. What does this mean to you? And I sort of indicated to her what I had observed in her coming to the office each week. And that was sort of the opening for us. And eventually the coat opened up, the gloves came off, and we were able to have the kind of therapeutic relationship that was required for her to gain what she needed to gain, and for me to gain what I needed to as a budding practitioner. But now this was back in the 70s. But I think the same kind of concept can take place today, as happened then with me, in terms of just opening up and indicating who you are, what does this relate to, and how does this affect you as the client and me as the worker.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Torres. I don't know exactly what that experience was like for you, but having supervised interns and been a clinician myself, I can definitely say that I had to have the conversation with interns about, have you ever had a Black supervisor before? And most of them had not. And that we are used to that, right? We're used to walking about in the world, having to explain ourselves and having to justify ourselves, and knowing that we are automatically, before we even open up our mouths, we are automatically perceived as less competent, less skilled, less able, just less. And so we're sort of always in this person down position where we have to kind of explain ourselves, and that's exhausting. It's exhausting to have to do that all the time. So I hope that you are well held and supported by your supervisor. And I do think that that's an important part of this, is supervisors to be at all levels of an organization, to be aware of these dynamics and providing support for clinicians who are dealing with this. Because I think one of the challenges, being a clinician, part of our job necessitates that we're constantly questioning ourselves, that we are paying attention to our bodies, our minds, our thoughts. And that can lead to, well, maybe it's not that. Maybe if I just do this, then that will change. And maybe it's, and second guessing ourselves, also part of living in a racist society. So, and I think often, especially with white supervisors, the instinct is to discount race as a factor. So pushing against that. And when a clinician, an intern, whoever comes to you and says, I think that my client is racist, pushing against the instinct to say that's probably not it, and instead saying that probably is it. Let's start there. Let's not end there. Let's start there, and let's talk about what you need to be able to do this work can you do this work with this particular client? How can I support you? Because sometimes, I mean, clinical work is hard, right? And we all have had clients that we even love, but that working with them is still exhausting, and we need a place to be able to go to unwind and to kind of breathe from that. So supervisors providing that support, so that clinicians know that they have someone to go to talk about what's happening, and that they don't have to hold it by themselves, I think is a really important part of being able to handle those encounters. And we're also constantly making the decision internally, just in our lives, about what we're going to respond to and what we're going to let go. And so I think getting, I think this person said this thing. I know they said this thing. Maybe they meant it. Do I let that go? Is it not a big deal? He didn't say hi to me when he walked in. He kept his coat buttoned up. That we're just constantly taking in information from the environment and processing it, and then deciding, what we're going to do with it. So also having somebody that we don't have to justify and explain to. I think it's one of the reasons that we need more leaders of color in nonprofit organizations, more clinicians of color who are supervising and leading, so that we can take one thing off of our plates and not have to explain or justify why that particular action rang a particular way with us, but that we can just have a safe space to be able to talk about that and then troubleshoot about what to do and how to move forward.
I would also put a call out to white supervisors and leaders and social workers to understand this, what our panelists are telling us right now, to listen to this, to hear them, to understand this is a reality, and to be able to figure out how to respond and support people of color when they are working with racist white clients, and all of the nuances of that work.
You are on mute, Felicia. Are you?
Okay, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I think I kind of want to touch on the third question. Is racism complicated to treat because it reflects ingrained patterns of thinking and behavior similar to a personality disorder? I don't know. I don't think we should be associating racism with like a mental disorder. It's not a mental disorder. It's taught. We we are taught to be, to uphold and maintain white supremacy. So we should be pushing away from that narrative. It shouldn't, because when too many people use that as a scapegoat to say like, hey, I have a mental disorder, or I have this disability, that's why I can't do this. No, there are many ways to fight racism, and that doesn't always mean you have to be on the street. It doesn't mean you always have to be a speaker. There are many ways to combat this. So I don't want to hear the excuse of this, because that's not true, because you have a lot of BIPOC people who are dealing with their own disabilities, who are still fighting, who still have to continue the fight because they don't have the choice. So definitely keep that mindset out. It's not a mental disorder, please. It is taught. You can unlearn it, and you can teach people to be better.
So Felicia, thank you. That is actually perfect transition for what will be our last question. And unfortunately, we only have 2 minutes. And so maybe if the panelists want to keep it very short so multiple people can get a thought in here. But right, thinking about racism as being, right, how is this something that we combat? How do we convince those who believe in colorblindness to accept equity rather than equality, right? So how do we challenge these kind of colorblind dominant narratives?
I can make this short and sweet. I don't argue with people about that. You believe it or you don't. It's not my job to convince you that it exists. Maybe I'll send you some resources or to a podcast, but that's not my job.
I think that's my job as a white person, and I do address this in teaching and supervision and trainings, because lots of white folks are taught that colorblindness is the right way to think and to be. And what I do find is that for white people, when they understand the cycle of socialization that we're all taught from a very young age, it's not our fault for some of us. We're taught these things about the myth of meritocracy, and everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and it's all a cover for racism and white supremacy. So when I begin to pull back the veil on the laws and policies and actions and behaviors that have created inequity, so that Black and brown people in this country have far different experiences than white people, when they begin to learn those facts, it can begin to help to change the way they think. I also find, as Rebecca pointed out, that working in biracial dyads can be really helpful about this work to get multiple perspectives, but that I do think white people need white people to teach them how to not believe in colorblindness.
I'll just leave
All
it
right,
at that.
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for answering these these questions. And so I think that we learned a lot from all of your insights and experiences. So it's 7:55. We only have 5 minutes left, and I need to pass it on to Jamie, who has to who will talk about the evaluation that needs to take place before we end.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob, for your fantastic moderation, and to all of our panelists. This was so wonderful. Thank you for making our first virtual MLK forum a success. So I am dropping the evaluation for today in the chat. This is your ticket to 2 CEUs for participating in tonight's program. So you can get that evaluation in the chat. It was also linked in the email you received from me last night, not once, but twice. So you definitely have the link. So go ahead and complete that evaluation. Let us know what you thought about tonight's event. It'll ask you for a 4-digit code. So this is how we know that you're here, you're paying attention, and you got a lot out of tonight's program. So ready? Our code is MK20, M as in Martin, K as in King, the number 2, the number 0. So MK20, you're entered into your evaluation. We have over 200 folks, almost 250 folks on tonight, which is amazing. But we have to process all of our CE forms by hand, so it will take us some time to get those to you. So they're personalized, and we know they're just for you, for your participation tonight. So please give us some grace and time to get those back to you. You'll get them via email, likely within the next 2 weeks. And as Rob mentioned earlier, we will make sure that you get all of the resources mentioned tonight, both those that were included in the reading list you got in the email last night and that has been linked here, but also adding all of the wonderful resources that were mentioned. So you got a really full list. If you have any administrative questions, you can drop them. I'll hang out here and you can drop them in the chat and I'll help that. I'm happy to answer them. But otherwise, thank you all so much. Oh, and there is a question about capitalization. It does not matter. You can use lowercase m, capital, whatever you are feeling tonight. It all works, so we will take it. And there was one question that I hope you all can just give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down. There was some interest in consultation or working with some of you, having further conversations at a later date. Are you open to sharing your email and having participants be in contact with you about your services? Okay, cool. Awesome. So we will include that in the event follow-up as well.
I just want to add, make sure you're compensating us too. It's work to supervise, to provide you education, and so make sure you're willing to compensate as well.
Yes, thank you, Felicia. Absolutely.
Well, for me at least. I can't speak for anyone else.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all. Thank you for being here. And we look forward to having you at next year's 8th Annual MLK Forum. Until then, take care and we will see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Rob, Judith.